dear listener, and welcome to Season 3 of the Arms Control Poseur podcast, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and funded by the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. In this season of the podcast, one of our three rotational hosts will guide you through current challenges faced in arms control. Hosted by either Timothy Wright, Fabian Hinz, or myself, Wolf Christian Pies, we will cover various timely challenges and issues in the world of arms control. Our podcast will cover topics ranging from new technologies, the diversion of firearms, to missile programs and technologies or sanctions regimes. So, without further ado, let's get started.
My name is Tim Wright. I'm a research associate in the Defense and Military Analysis program at the IISS, and I'm joined today by Karim El-Baz, who is an assistant professor in the political science program at Galala University in Egypt, and also a research fellow at the Royal Military College of Canada. Karim, how are you?
All good, Tim. So nice to hear back from you.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining today. And what we're going to be talking about today is missiles in the Middle East and also any potential transparency and confidence building mechanisms that could apply to the region. So, Karim, maybe for some of our listeners who are not particularly familiar with the role that missiles play in the Middle East, can you provide maybe a little bit of a brief overview of the landscape in terms of who some of the main possessors are, what sort of systems do they have, and what sort of systems they're seeking?
Oh, sure thing. Well, first, since we are talking in the Middle East or about the Middle East, we have to differentiate between missiles and rockets, because in both Persian and Arabic, the translation for the two words is one single word, which is sarukh. A rocket is totally different from a missile. It can be simply defined as an unguided delivery vehicle with no steering ability once fired. A rocket can be an SLV, like a space launch vehicle, like the ones you see on SpaceX that takes the satellites to the orbit, or sounding rockets that are used to calculate certain atmospheric measurements, or the artillery rockets, the unguided ones that are used by Hamas, for instance. Whereas a missile, it looks similar to a rocket, but it's a totally different military term. It's a guided delivery vehicle with a steering ability in flight, which means it can direct itself with a steering ability and change its targets or its trajectory while flying. For example, you have the anti-tank guided missiles. An operator will look into a scope and guide a missile while in flight until it hits its target, or a Tomahawk missile, the cruise missiles, the hypersonic light vehicles, and of course the main theme that we are talking about today is the ballistic missiles itself. For ballistic missiles, they are differentiated into four different categories. The short-range ballistic missiles, which ranges up to 1,000 kilometers. The medium-range ballistic missiles that ranges up to 3,000 kilometers. The intermediate-range ballistic missiles that are up to 5,500 kilometers, and the ICBMs, which are 5,500 kilometers plus. For each of these specific types of ballistic missiles, we have a specifically designed air defense mechanism that can counter it. For example, with short-range ballistic missiles, you can use terminal systems or Patriots. With medium-range ballistic missiles, you can use the THAAD. With IRBMs or intermediate-range ballistic missiles, you can use the Aegis systems, and the ICBMs, we can use the GBI. In the Middle East, we have mainly three tiers. The first ones are the countries who manufacture and operate their own industry of ballistic missiles. And this category has only two countries in the region, Israel and Iran. And we have a second tier that are countries with limited indigenous capabilities but rely on external suppliers. And this tier includes countries from Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, and even the UAE. And there is a third tier, which is one of my favorite, which are the non-state actors. Actors who are not states still are in possess of ballistic missile capabilities. These actors are, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, or Ansarullah al-Housiyin in Yemen.
So with these tiers then, I mean, we can see how countries could go up and also potentially go down. And we're seeing some countries which might be in the second tier at the moment, they could potentially progress up to the first tier. So I'm thinking of perhaps the United Arab Emirates as an example. It has a very robust and growing defense industry focused around Edge Group, which is looking at guided weaponry. Saudi Arabia as well has a strong interest in developing ballistic missiles. There's a couple of sites that have been identified throughout the country. So at the moment, it's just Israel and Iran, but potentially in the future, do you think it's fair to say that that could include more countries that have fully fledged domestic capabilities?
Well, when we talk about ballistic missiles, perhaps this will be the case for cruise missiles because they are more cheap, affordable, and most importantly, more accurate. With ballistic missiles, it's a different story because it's a huge investment for these countries. So if you are going to start this investment that will take up to decades until you reach to a reliable model with an accurate CEV, which is a circular error probable, which is the unit of measurement that we use to calculate the exact accuracy of the missile, I think there will be a huge military doctrine or strategy or mindset that guide it and steers the state towards possessing this weapon and not any other. For instance, and this is something I have discussed in my book that will be actually published tomorrow and will be available for everyone on Routledge. Why do countries possess ballistic missiles in the first place? So there is a policy-oriented school of thought. The one that you read almost in every international publication. You have the deterrent theory. Oh, this one actor A has ballistic missiles, so actor B needs to get ballistic missiles to deter it. Or a balance of power, or the security dilemma, or a matter of national pride, a security norm, bureaucratic interest, or inter-service rivalry. However, within the military, when you talk to the military people on the topics, they totally have a different perspective on the matter and why do countries possess ballistic missiles in the first place. Let's agree, first of all, that ballistic missiles carrying conventional payloads are ineffective, inaccurate, and inefficient as well.
I know you've written previously on this, and by the way, I'm looking forward to your book. And if you could please tell us the name of it, that would be fantastic as well, because I'm sure some of our listeners would be curious to pick it up.
The book name is Ballistic Missile Proliferation in Non-Nuclear States, the Origins of Ballistic Missile Programs in the Middle East.
Fantastic. I'm sure many of our listeners would like to pick that up. I know you've written about this previously, and you talk about some of the different drivers and reasons for countries in the Middle East for acquiring ballistic missiles. And you talk about things around, well, for some countries, you hear a national pride might be, a reason for it. But then you have a very good argument where you sort of tear that down and you say, well, actually, there are intentional and unintentional military vulnerabilities that lead to countries in the region wanting to possess these capabilities. For some of the intentional ones, for example, with states that are concerned about if their armed forces are potentially too powerful, that then might then sort of potentially threaten their power, that the countries then might pursue ballistic missiles because they provide a surrogate capability in that they provide a deterrence capability, they provide the ability to strike their opponents, but it's done in a way that's not really threatening to that country's government. And you also talk about the unintentional reasons as well, that militaries lack resources to acquire air forces, so they rely on missiles again as a sort of a surrogate. And do you see that landscape potentially changing in the Middle East?
Thank you so much, Tim, for this. Actually, every single military asset, not just missiles, is a product of a specific military vulnerability. And this is actually the exact military-oriented thought, as the proliferation or evolution of military systems is a process portrayed by a moment of consciousness, a moment that you realize a specific vulnerability and you turn to an R&D solution to fix it. For instance, and this is ancient, not really something new, in 1503, during the Italian Civil War, when gunpowder and cannons were introduced in siege warfare, and the French were actually quite successful in tearing down some Italian fortifications using cannons. What was the R&D reaction to that? Mm-hmm. Something we call the Trust Italian. You see a new type of fortifications that are star-shaped that can counter this kind of bombardment. You have another example that is more recent, which is the CIWS, the close-in weapon systems that are installed on naval vessels that are used to intercept incoming missiles. Why they were introduced? When the Soviets proliferated their P-15 Termits to Middle Eastern countries and others abroad like Vietnam, the Western naval assets became quite vulnerable to these types of attack. So they needed to find an R&D solution to counter this specific vulnerability. Now let's go back to the missiles. Ballistic missiles as an idea came up in 1934 by Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun in Germany. For most of the German military aristocrats like Heinz Guderian, Rommel, etc., this was a failure. They thought, ballistic missiles, what can they do? Also, they can take a payload and transfer it to another country, and voila, it ends. So for them, a ballistic missile was merely an artillery shell with a longer range, but with a much higher cost for the state's economy. Why higher cost? Because you spend a lot of resources, fuel, and valuable minerals like aluminum that can be used to feed other service branches, such as the Air Force or the Navy. However, by the late 1942s and the early 1943, when the German Luftwaffe lost its aerial supremacy, they needed a new way to deliver the payloads. And this is actually funny because the very first rockets were not called the V2, which stands for the Weapons of Revenge. It was called the aggregate, A4 and A3, from A1 to A4 missiles. And then its name was changed when it became operational and licensed to mass production into the V2 model and the V1 models, which stands for Revenge. After the end of the Second World War, this debate remained between the East and the West. The West represented the US and Europe, and the East represented the Soviet Union. The US still believed that ballistic missiles are merely artillery shell with a longer range and much higher cost. And they can instead rely on Air Force to deliver these payloads. If you are using bombers escorted by fighter aircrafts, you can deliver payloads deep into the Soviet territories. However, this all changed in 1958. Why 1958?
You've got me.
Because of the Sputnik crisis, when the Soviet Union launched for the first time an intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7 missile, in 1958. The people in the US were like, oh wow, now the Soviet Union, who doesn't really have efficient air force to deliver payloads to our mainlands, now can deliver without using a single aircraft.
And we call it a Sputnik moment, don't we now? In English, when we say that there's something that's a huge technological change or a leap, we call it a Sputnik moment.
Exactly. So, since then, ballistic missiles came quite associated with the realm of nuclear weapons. When you look into ballistic missiles, a ballistic missile attack. In the Western mentality, it's a synonym for a nuclear attack. In the Middle East, we can't have this same mentality because most of the ballistic operators in the Middle East, with the only exception of Israel, are non-nuclear states.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think then that, given the historic ties between ballistic missiles and WMD, why have so many countries in the Middle East procured them or sought their development when they don't possess these capabilities? And why do you think some of these countries are holding on to some of the much older systems? I mean, Egypt still operates Scuds. My colleague Fabian Hinz had a really fantastic IISS military balance blog about this a few months ago, where he was looking at a Scud base just outside of Cairo. It's clearly still operational. They're still clearly being practiced within the Egyptian armed forces. The same with the UAE as well. They operate Scuds, and North Korean supplied Hwasong 5s. Why do you think some countries hold on to these systems if the military utility and the military capabilities of them are pretty low? I mean, we were talking earlier about lack of accuracy. We're seeing that change now with some more advanced systems. Ballistic missiles are increasingly being used for conventional warfighting. We're seeing the Russians doing it with Iskanders in Ukraine. We're seeing the Ukrainians do it with US-supplied ATACMS, which the Americans have used as well in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's starting to change quite a bit. But we're still seeing some countries holding on to these really old ballistic missile capabilities. Why do you think that is? Do you think that's because they still are seen as being a useful deterrent or a useful weapon of terror, perhaps? Or what is it, do you think, that keeps countries holding on to these?
No, this is the diplomatic answer, like the answer you will get from a civilian diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but definitely not the military answer or the military-oriented answer. I believe a very short answer to this question lies within the very essence of the military doctrine adopted by this or that country. Mm-hmm. For instance, and thank you so much for opening this up, Egypt was the very first country in the Middle East to indigenously develop a ballistic missile, Al-Qahir and Al-Zafir, towards the late 1950s. Few years even before the Israeli ballistic missile program started.
Yep.
And why is that? In 1954, when Egypt went into what we call the Czechoslovak arms deal, mm-hmm. Egypt used to operate a Western-oriented military doctrine. After all, Egypt was occupied by Great Britain for a time, and its military got trained by the UK in process. However, in 1954, when Egypt switched its side and went closer to the Soviet Union for an arms deal, you don't merely import arms from this country, but you also import technical and tactical expertise from this country. So this process changes your military doctrine into to the very same one of your arms supplier, because they are the ones who are training you on how to use these weapons in field manuals. Few months was the Suez Crisis. Air Commodore C.M. Head, who was the military attaché at the British Embassy in Cairo, sent a dispatch back home assessing the capabilities of the Egyptian Air Force. This dispatch, I believe, was number 111 for the year 56. And in this dispatch he said, and I quote, "The Egyptian Air Force handful of experienced pilots were good, but because of the newly adopted Soviet tactical air power doctrine, they have inherited war flying techniques, and they were poor standards in instrument and night flying. They had very little comprehension of air warfare operations and tactics. They are in no position to take on the Israelis." And his anticipation was quite accurate, because in 1956, Egypt had a very effective Air Force assets, like the Meteor Mk-13, the Ilyushin 28, the MiG-15s, versus the Israeli Canadair and Mesties. Still, despite having this extensive Air Force assets, most of the Egyptian Air Force actually fled the battle back to the south or to Saudi Arabia, because they were not able to handle the dogfight. For politicians and military analysts at this moment, this is called a moment of consciousness, in which you realize that you have a specific military vulnerability. For the Egyptian military analysts and strategists, how will you tackle this very same vulnerability? I believe the answer will be, turn back to the Soviet Union, the ones from which you imported your own military doctrine at that time, and see how they figured out to tackle their own Air Force vulnerability. And you will find out the answer in adopting ballistic missiles.
Right, and I mean, Egypt's not one of the only countries in the region which has ballistic missiles. Iran has a very particularly large arsenal. I think US CENTCOM say that the arsenal's around 2,000 to 3,000 missiles or so. The number of launchers they have is smaller, but ballistic missiles have been an important part of Iran's military doctrine since the Iran-Iraq War, the war of the war of the cities, where the Iraqis and the Iranians were sort of launching scuds at each other's and terrorizing.
This gets back to the very same question you asked earlier, the type of military vulnerabilities. So for the case of Egypt, it was an unintentional vulnerability. This is what we have. This is our assets. This is the training we possess and the military doctrine we have in our hand. We had nothing to do with it. So this is what we call unintentional military vulnerability. For the case of Iran, actually there is a historical policy in the realm of arms control, that Iran sought ballistic missile capabilities because of the war with Iraq, or the use of Iraq ballistic missiles against Iran in the War of the Cities. Actually, Iran thought of ballistic missile capabilities years before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and I believe it was the very Shah of Iran at that time who decided to cooperate with the Israelis on what we call Project Flower to develop missile capabilities for Iran. For Iran, what really rushed them into adopting ballistic missile capabilities in the 1980s is a different story. The very first chapter of this story lies within the Iranian Air Force personnel. In 1980, few months after the Islamic Revolution succeeded, a group of Iranian pilots decided to plot a coup d'etat against the Khomeini regime at that time. It was later called the Nujah coup attempt. The plan was simple, that few pilots, accompanied by ex-special force members of the Shah's military, will go and occupy the Nujah air base, and they will fly several F-4 Phantoms aircrafts and bombard the Khomeini residence. For the Islamic Revolution of Iran regime at that time, they perceived the Air Force branch as quite suspicious. They became afraid of, because it was the most favored branch for the Shah, and they really distrusted them, labeling them as disloyal as well in process. And they established what was later called in Iran with the Air Force the committees, or the committees. Simply, only trustworthy Iranian pilots were allowed to fly their aircrafts against Iraq, and some of them were accompanied by co-pilots who had actually no flight experience. They were only handed a gun, and for them all their job was to monitor the behavior of the pilot, and in case they became suspicious of the pilot, they were licensed to shoot him in the mid-air. Also, the Iranian pilots throughout the war were not allowed within the proximity of 40 kilometers from Tehran while flying.
Mm-hmm.
With the time, the Iranian Air Force capabilities deteriorated because their main air service branch was reliable on the US. The F-14s, the F-4s, the F-5s all needed spare parts and munitions that only came through the US. They were able to smuggle few spare parts for the F-4s from Germany, from Israel even, but still those smuggled commodities cannot really sustain the whole branch. So how will they overcome this specific vulnerability? The answer lies within ballistic missiles.
I mean, Iran has then spent a lot of time and a lot of money pursuing these capabilities, from starting off with, I think as I understand it, Libyan-supplied Scuds, which they then reverse-engineered, and now they've got a huge number of systems. We, in the Military Balance book, sometimes even struggle to keep up with how many systems they have because they bring out so many new variants. But there are essentially a core family of different missiles that they use. I'm not going to go try to get into that because I'm not an Iranian missile expert. My colleague Fabian Hinz certainly is, though. But I want to talk a little bit around Iran's use of missiles recently. There's, of course, a lot of tension in the Middle East right now, which is being driven by the Israeli-Hamas war. The Iranians and the Israelis have both launched strikes against each other. And right now, the day of recording is the 13th of August, and we are waiting potentially for an Iranian strike against Israel after a suspected Israeli assassination of Hamas's leader in Tehran. Now, the Iranians launched various different types of ballistic cruise missiles and also one-way attack munitions against Israel on the 13th of April. Do you think that attack proved or disproved the military utility of ballistic missiles? Maybe we'll just stick to the ballistics rather than go into all of them. I mean, I'll be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
I believe we will highly misjudge the use or misuse of ballistic missiles if we compared it or took it in perspective when we assess the late Iranian attack of ballistic missiles on Israel. Why? Because Iran was quite careful, releasing intel almost everywhere that they are going to attack, even to Egypt. So when you attack someone, you really don't disperse this amount of intel on the timing of the attack, or wait for specific US naval assets to be present in exact points for interception in the air. And the same thing for the Israelis. I believe what the Iranians needed at that time was to prove that they are capable of hitting Israel in the first place, but this was not their very priorities. Their very first priority is to feed their loyalists within Iran. So let me ask you a question, Tam. What is power?
What is power? Power is the ability to, I suppose, frighten your adversaries, demonstrate your resolve, deter.
This is one definition. However, I take a totally different one. Power is what you believe is power. For Iran, it's the idea of Khomeini itself. This is how the Iranian regime rests. The very essence of legitimacy in Iran is the righteousness of the Khomeini regime or the Mullah regime. So, for you to sustain this state of righteousness, you need to stick to specific causes in the region upon which you have built your legitimacy, which is based on 3 sentences in Iran. Al-Mawtu li-America, Al-Mawtu li-Israel, Al-Nasru li-Islam. Death to America, death to Israel, victory to Islam. So when you actually fire these missiles against Israel, you feed the beliefs of the loyalists upon which you rely on to sustain your very regime. But at the same time, you don't want your attack to be quite destructive for the Israelis to avoid the retaliation, because then you will be in a state of war and your economy, the Iranian economy, is not quite capable of withstanding a very long war with Israel, especially during the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, because most of their eastern allies are quite occupied on the Ukrainian front. So for the incoming or expected attack of Iran on Israel, I believe the attack will be, yes, extensive, but still it will have quite minimal damage on Israel. And this equation can actually fulfill desires of the Iranian regimes to feed in the beliefs of their loyalists and to avoid a massive Israeli retaliation on Iran at the same time.
So it's a calibrated, controlled response, one that essentially says to the Israelis, look, we've hit back, but this isn't going to be so damaging that you feel the need to respond at the same level or even more. And you can sort of see that how the Israelis responded to the Iranian attack, the missile strike near the the Natanz nuclear facility, where several missiles knocked out an Iranian SAM, a surface-to-air missile, in a way, and it just sort of says a message to the Iranians of, we can also launch strikes inside of your territory. We're not going to take it too far, but just so you know, we can do this. Maybe we've talked a lot about capabilities, and this is the Arms Control Poseur podcast, so maybe we need to turn a little bit to arms control. Now, obviously, the chances of there being any sort of Middle East, intermediate range nuclear forces treaty of some sort is probably not possible. But what might be more possible is more lower hanging fruit, perhaps transparency and confidence building measures, which can be used to reduce risk and misunderstanding, especially when these systems are being exercised or tested. Now, there is a mechanism, of course, that's already available to our listeners who are not familiar with it. It's called the Hague Code of Conduct. It's a multilateral ballistic missile pre-launch notification regime, and it currently has 145 states listed as subscribers. Now, there aren't many states in the Middle East which are subscribers. Qatar joined several months ago, which was a bit of a surprise. But other than that, there are quite a few blind spots there in the region. Why do you think that there is reluctance in the region to join the regime, especially among countries that possess either very few or even no ballistic missile capabilities? You would think that this would be quite a simple thing for them to join. They don't have ballistic missiles or space launch vehicle capabilities. So I'd be interested to hear, why do you think there's some reluctance?
I believe there is a huge distrust between regimes in the Middle East, and this was quite relevant when President Sisi wanted to establish an Arabian NATO force, an Arabian military alliance under the guidance of the League of Arab States. And then the case was dismissed once and for all. Even against a common threat like the Iranian threat on the GCC countries, these countries were quite reluctant to integrate their missile air defense systems. Only if these air defense systems in the regions were integrated, they would have had a higher chance of intercepting incoming threats. Still, despite the presence of this common threat, they have not integrated their air defense codes or systems. Why? Distrust. As for what you have said on the HCOC, and it's also a derivative of the MTCR, or the Missile Technology Control Regime, that bans states with indigenous missile capabilities to export missiles to other countries beyond the range of 300 kilometers.
And the 500 kilo payload, we've got to remember that. It's the and as well, it's not just the range.
And the 500 kilogram payload, of course. For many military analysts or military personnel in the Middle East, the MTCR, whenever they are asked for advice, is not a favorable deal, because you can still go around it. Let's look, for example, into the Scalp missile, or the Storm Shadow cruise missile that is manufactured between the UK and France. It has a range of approximately 300 kilometers, right?
Yep, with the export version.
The export mode, exactly. It can be carried on a Rafale F-3 aircraft that has a combat radius, I believe, of 1,800 kilometers.
Okay.
So you see, even a missile under the MTCR treaty can reach into ranges beyond 2,000 kilometers. So for military analysts, a missile like the Scalp, which its export version is under the MTCR with maximum range of 300 kilometers, it can go beyond 2,000 kilometers when carried on an aircraft whose combat radius is beyond 1,800 kilometers.
Do you think then if there is a distrust of regimes, especially, the HCOC in a way came from MTCR, do you think that a regional-led process would be better? Or do you think that maybe things like the HCOC, they're conceived in a way which doesn't really apply and work very well in the Middle East? Do you think that there are other sort of frameworks which could be done, whether they be bilateral or whether they don't necessarily have the same formality as something like the HCOC, but that would be more applicable to the region? Do you think that there are other ways of doing this?
Of course, there is always a possibility to do it. The main question is how. We know the whys to stabilize the region, to build confidence amongst the countries. But how is the important question. When we look from the diplomat eye, I don't think you will be able to do much. However, from the military eye, I believe, yes, you can. Let's look, for example, into the Egyptian-Israeli relation. Most of the relation is commandeered or steered by a joint military committee between both sides. Even during the ceasefire after the Yom Kippur War, this process was taken over by military from both sides. And when military personnel sit together, they actually achieved something, a reliable thing, a solid thing that we have stood for over 40 years till now. In the Middle East, I believe we have a need for a military dialogue, an inter-military dialogue between the region military personnel for them to sit together under a specific umbrella, for them to tackle the very essence of military vulnerabilities and how they can build the confidence on the military levels. Because once you build the confidence on the military levels, this will reflect on the diplomatic one automatically.
I see.
However, if you did vice versa on the diplomatic version, the diplomats will go back to consult with the militaries of their own countries. And the militaries of their own countries might tell them, no, this is a bad deal. We can't do this. We will be vulnerable. How do you expect us to defend ourselves if you decided to ban specific weapons from us?
I see. So it's perhaps sort of the reverse of how it might be in other countries where it'll be the MFA leading the process, but maybe in the Middle East, it's more of if you create that intramilitary dialogue, as you say, that then builds the foundation from which then you can then have perhaps then more concrete agreements either between MFAs or MFAs then can be working with multilateral frameworks like the HCOC. I mean, there's also then, the difficulty in the region as well of there are non-state actors, and we talked about this earlier, but there are non-state actors with missile capabilities as well. And, in some ways, some of these non-state actors have much greater capabilities than some states in the region. How do you account for that? Something that we don't have to think about in Europe and doesn't really have to be thought about anywhere else in the world. And that again creates a whole load of difficulty.
Well, when you deal with non-state actors, you actually don't deal with them, but you need to deal with who supplies them in the first place, because still the Houthis, despite their possession of ballistic missile capabilities, they still lack the capabilities to indigenously or fully develop 100% their ballistic missile capabilities. They have to rely on engine parts from Iran, for example. So if you want to tackle this issue, you don't actually negotiate with the Houthis. You negotiate your own supplier with sufficient and technical, industrial expertise who feeds them in the first place.
That's it. You talk to the Iranians instead. Well, thank you, Karim. I think we'll then call it a day there. It's been fantastic speaking with you. I'm really grateful for your time and also for your knowledge on this, especially on something which I think a lot of Europeans need to know more about, especially considering the tension in the Middle East and the prominent role that missiles are playing in wars and crises that are happening there. So thank you very much for your time, and we're going to then wrap the next episode of the Arms Control Poseur. So thank you so much, and take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
That's all we have time for today, so thank you to our guest for sharing his expertise and knowledge with us. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more information, visit the IISS website, and as always, be sure to follow the IISS on X and LinkedIn, where IISS analysts will be sharing their insights and quick takes. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate and subscribe to the Arms Control Poseur podcast wherever you listen to your favourite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you, and until next time.